By 1945, the most fearsome war machine in all of history lay shattered. Each of Hitler's 5 fatal errors brought Germany one step closer to collapse. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched the largest land invasion in human history. 3.5 million Axis soldiers crossed into Soviet territory that morning. No army in modern warfare had ever attempted anything on this scale. Hitler's plan demanded total Soviet collapse within 8 to 10 weeks. German logistics were designed for France, not a continent-sized Soviet Union. By October, German tanks were within 60 miles of Moscow's city center. Then the Soviet winter arrived, and Germany was utterly unprepared for it. Wehrmacht engines froze solid, weapons jammed, frostbite claimed more men than bullets. The Soviet Union did not collapse. It mobilized, and it fought back hard. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched a devastating counteroffensive at Moscow. Stalin mobilized fresh Siberian divisions, troops fully equipped for extreme Arctic warfare. By year's end, Germany had suffered over 800,000 irreplaceable casualties on the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa had failed. The quick victory Hitler needed never came. Fatal mistake number 1: invading the Soviet Union without a plan to finish it. 4 days later, Hitler committed the second, and perhaps most catastrophic, mistake. Hitler voluntarily declared war on the United States, a nation he deeply underestimated. President Roosevelt received the news and immediately requested a full declaration of war. Hitler believed America was too divided, too weak, and too far away to matter. What Hitler failed to grasp was the full scale of American industrial potential. In 1944 alone, America produced 96,000 aircraft. Germany managed fewer than 41,000. American war production also armed Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. By mid-1943, American and British bombers were destroying German cities around the clock. Germany now faced enemies on every front, in the air, sea, and on land. Fatal mistake number 2: declaring war on the world's greatest industrial superpower. But even with 2 unwinnable enemies, Germany's own command was destroying itself from within. Hitler increasingly overruled his own generals, men with decades of professional combat experience. Between 1941 and 1945, Hitler dismissed or overruled over 900 senior Wehrmacht officers. General Franz Halder, Army Chief of Staff, kept a secret diary documenting Hitler's errors. Halder wrote, "Hitler's decisions were becoming increasingly divorced from operational military reality. At Stalingrad, Hitler personally ordered the Sixth Army to hold at all costs and die. Field Marshal Paulus begged permission to break out. Hitler refused him absolutely and completely. On February 2, 1943, 91,000 German survivors surrendered at Stalingrad. Stalingrad broke the myth of German invincibility and shattered Wehrmacht morale permanently. Fatal mistake number 3: one man's ego systematically dismantling Germany's professional military command. While Germany fought, its economy ran on peacetime footing, shockingly unprepared for total war. Hitler feared civilian unrest above all else, so he prioritized consumer goods over weapons production. In 1941, Germany produced just 3,256 tanks. The Soviet Union built over 6,200 that same year. In February 1942, Albert Speer was appointed armaments minister and began emergency reforms immediately. Speer's reforms were brilliant, but they arrived nearly 3 years too late to matter. Germany also failed to mobilize women into war industry, unlike every major Allied power. Fatal mistake number 4: fighting a total war with a deliberately restrained peacetime economy. By 1944, Germany was fighting simultaneously on 5 distinct and unsustainable military fronts. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in northern France. Simultaneously, the Soviet Operation Bagration destroyed an entire German army group within weeks. Germany had no strategic reserves left to respond to any of these simultaneous catastrophic crises. Hitler's desperate gamble in the Ardennes in December 1944 consumed Germany's last strategic reserves. Fatal mistake number 5. Strategic overextension across fronts no single nation could possibly sustain. By April 1945, Soviet artillery could be heard from inside Hitler's own underground bunker. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler died by suicide in that bunker beneath a ruined city. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. 60 million people had perished worldwide. 5 fatal mistakes. 1 catastrophic war. A warning from history that still echoes today. In December 1941, Japan launched the most catastrophic strategic gamble in modern military history. 6 months later, the tide had turned forever, and Japan's defeat became a mathematical certainty. Japan's empire stretched across a third of the globe, yet it could not sustain that conquest. 5 fatal mistakes sealed Japan's fate, and each one compounded the last with terrible force. Mistake 1. Japan chose war with the United States, a nation it fundamentally misunderstood. Japanese planners assumed America was soft, isolationist, and would never fight a long war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto knew better, but his warnings were ignored by Japan's high command. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard, worked in Washington, and knew the American industrial machine well. He predicted Japan could run wild for 6 months, but after that, nothing could be promised. Pearl Harbor was a tactical masterpiece, yet a grand strategic blunder of the highest order. Japan sank battleships, but the 3 U.S. Pacific Fleet carriers were at sea, safely out of port. Those carriers would become the weapons that reversed the entire course of the Pacific War. Fatal mistake 2. Japan was already trapped in China before it attacked Pearl Harbor at all. From 1937 to 1941, the war in China cost Japan over 1 million casualties and billions of dollars. Despite vast territorial gains, Japan could not break Chinese resistance or force a surrender. By 1941, over 1 million Japanese soldiers were pinned down in China with no end in sight. This quagmire drained troops, supply, and morale that Japan desperately needed elsewhere in the Pacific. China became Japan's bleeding wound, drawing strength for a war it could not afford to lose. Japan entered the Pacific War already exhausted, already overcommitted, and already running short. Fatal mistake 3. Japan gambled everything at Midway in June 1942 and lost it all. Admiral Yamamoto divided his fleet into 6 separate groups, spreading his strength fatally thin. U.S. Navy cryptanalysts had broken Japan's naval code and knew every detail of the attack plan. Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned 3 U.S. carriers at Point Luck, north of Midway, in ambush. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese carriers were caught rearming planes below their open decks. Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise in Yorktown dropped into a near vertical dive. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were ablaze, their war-trained crews lost with them. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers at Midway, with hundreds of its most experienced naval aviators. These were not ordinary pilots. They were the elite airmen who had trained for over a decade. Japan's pilot training program produced fewer qualified aviators each year than the war consumed. The U.S., by contrast, ran a massive training program that produced thousands of aviators every month. By the end of 1942, U.S. carriers and pilots simply outnumbered their imperial Japanese counterparts. In 1944 alone, the United States built more aircraft than Japan managed from 1939 to 1945. Japan built 15 new carriers after Midway, but the Americans built over 150. Fatal mistake 4. Japan entered the war with a merchant fleet too small to sustain its empire. Before the war, Japan imported 10 million tons annually, but her fleet could carry only 6 million. Japan imported 90% of its oil, most of its iron, coal, rubber, and nearly all its food. American submarines began hunting Japanese merchant shipping from the first day of the Pacific War. U.S. submarines sank over half of all Japanese merchant ships lost throughout the entire Pacific War. Japan delayed convoy escort systems until 1943, and by then, the damage was already irreversible. By April 1945, Japan's oil imports had completely stopped, paralyzing its navy and air force. Fuel was so scarce that the Yamato's final mission in April 1945 carried only a one-way supply. She was sunk by U.S. carrier aircraft before reaching Okinawa, taking nearly 2,500 of her crew down. Fatal Mistake 5. Japan's army and navy fought each other almost as much as they fought the Allies. The Imperial Army and Navy ran separate industrial systems, separate supply chains, and separate wars. Neither service would share critical resources, aircraft, intelligence, or even trained personnel. During the Guadalcanal campaign, Army and Navy failures to coordinate directly cost Japan the island. Japanese Army units went hungry, while Navy supply runs prioritized ammunition for food and medicine. The Japanese military never created a joint command structure to unify strategy across all theaters. Every major strategic decision required negotiation between rivals who refused to share real information. This structural dysfunction made Japan incapable of reacting coherently to rapidly shifting Allied pressure. By 1943, the United States was producing at a rate Japan could never dream of matching or sustaining. America launched more ships in 1941 alone than Japan during the entire course of the war. Japan could not replace its carrier losses. The U.S. replaced every loss and added many more besides. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 destroyed what remained of Japanese naval air power. Japan lost over 400 aircraft and 3 carriers that day, with barely a scratch on the U.S. fleet. Japan's surviving pilots at this point had minimal training. Many could barely land on a carrier deck. By 1945, U.S. B-29 superfortresses were burning Japan's cities to the ground without serious opposition. Over 60 Japanese cities were firebombed, killing hundreds of thousands and gutting war production. Japan's aircraft industry collapsed under bombing and resource starvation, producing barely nothing by spring. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force by the autumn of 1944. Kamikaze tactics were born from desperation, not doctrine. Japan had nothing left to fight with. Japan's soldiers fought to the last man on island after island, yet could not reverse the tide. The Battle of Okinawa cost Japan over 100,000 troops and thousands of kamikaze sorties. Even as defeat approached, Japan's leadership refused to accept reality until 2 atomic bombs fell. On August 6, 1945, the uranium bomb Little Boy detonated above Hiroshima at 1,900 feet altitude. Hiroshima was obliterated in a single flash, killing some 70,000 people instantly. 3 days later, a second bomb struck Nagasaki, killing 40,000 more and shocking Japan's leaders. Emperor Hirohito broadcast Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, in a recording never before heard. Across Japan, the emperor's voice was heard for the first time by millions who wept in the streets. On September 2, 1945, Japan signed the formal surrender aboard the battleship USS Missouri. Let us now summarize the 5 fatal mistakes that turned Japan's early triumph into total ruin. Mistake 1. Attacking Pearl Harbor unified America and made negotiated peace politically impossible forever. Mistake 2. The China War drained Japan before the Pacific War even began its opening phase. Mistake 3. Midway sacrificed Japan's 4 best carriers and its irreplaceable core of veteran pilots. Mistake 4. Japan's merchant fleet was too small, too unprotected, and fatally vulnerable to submarines. Mistake 5. Army and Navy rivalry destroyed strategic coherence and wasted Japan's limited remaining strength. Each mistake compounded the others. No single error alone could have doomed Japan by itself. Japan's military was brave, disciplined, and technically capable, but strategic wisdom it fatally lacked. The United States outproduced Japan 16-1 in warships and overwhelmed her on every front. Japan's leaders chose war knowing they likely could not win it. Ideology overruled cold strategic math. The Japanese people paid for those decisions with over 3 million military and civilian dead. The 5 fatal mistakes were not inevitable. Each one was a choice made by men who knew better. History's verdict is clear. Overconfidence, poor strategy, and disunity doomed Imperial Japan completely.